Wow, what an amazing turnout tonight. It's almost like this is a relevant conversation about what's going on in the world. I don't know. Thank you so much for coming out to the BCA Center. My name is Heather Farrell. I'm the curator and director of exhibitions. Little feedback there. Sorry about that. And I want to thank you all for joining us for tonight's hybrid program, The Ethical Implications of AI. This is in conjunction with our exhibition co-created, The Artist in the Age of Intelligent Machines, guest curated by Chris Thompson. And we are very excited to have it on view now at the BCA Center through the first week of May. And we're very pleased as well to have Chris, our moderator tonight, with three very distinguished panelists. And that is Randall Harp, the Associate Professor of Philosophy at UVM, followed by Peter Gallo, a very well-known artist and critic, as well as Crystal Lahote, the Associate Professor of Philosophy, as well as Department Chair at St. Michael's College. And before I turn my time over to Chris tonight for the conversation, I'd like to make a few comments on the program format because it is a hybrid program, and say some thank yous as well. And for those of us who are joining via Zoom, we ask that you use the Zoom Q&A feature. And when we get to that point in the question and answers, and Jackie here, our curatorial assistant and Zoom mistress, will help pose those questions on behalf of you and our Zoom audience, as well as a reminder that we do have a chat feature if you'd like to add comments. And as well, remember, tonight's conversation is being recorded and will be posted in a few weeks to our BCA YouTube channel. So for those of you in our in-person audience, I'd like to ask that when it gets to the Q&A time that please raise your hand, and our wonderful Sarah Jane, our program assistant, will bring you the mic so that you can pose the question and we can have it recorded for our audiences. Now on to thank yous. Programs such as this, The Ethical Implications of AI, would not be possible without the support of the many community members who really come together and make this possible, as well as our dedicated BCA gallery, communications, and events teams. It really truly takes a village, and all the collaboration too that we've had with Chris Thompson, our guest curator, with the University of Vermont, and all of our guest panelists. Tonight's program specifically is supported in part by Vermont Humanities, as it is presented in part of our co-created exhibition. And these types of exhibitions and wonderful programs are also in turn supported by places like the Maslow Family Foundation, as well as the University of Vermont's College of Engineering and Mathematical Sciences, the University of Vermont's Office of the Vice President for Research, as well as HULA. And I'd like to thank our 2023 exhibition year sponsors for BCA Center, and that is Mascoma Bank, as well as additional support from the Vermont Humanities Council, or sorry, the Vermont Arts Council, I should say, and the National Endowment for the Arts. Whew. That's a lot of thank yous, but as you can tell, it takes a lot of people to bring us all together for these wonderful programs. And before I turn it over to Chris, I want you to mentally save the date for Saturday, April 15th, where we are going to have the Creative AI Vermont full day symposium at HULA. And tickets are available on our website. Please get them while they are available because they are limited. And Chris, I'm sure will talk a little bit more at the end of the program about the symposium, which will feature some of our artists and experts and some amazing keynote speakers in the field, and talk about this exciting collaboration between BCA and UVM. And with that, I would like to turn the time over to Chris and our wonderful panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. Appreciate it. So I think we're going to start out. I'm going to ask the panelists if they could each introduce themselves, talk a little bit about their background and their connection with artificial intelligence. Randall, you want to start?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Randall Harp. Again, I'm an associate professor of philosophy at UVM. My interest in AI is primarily through my interest in philosophy, which is primarily about agency, the sorts of things that we do. So I'm a philosopher of action, I'm a philosopher of agency, I look at collective action in particular. And we can think really briefly about agency in terms of just, we do things in the world, right? And we can think about AI either as a new tool that helps us to do the things that we want to do in the world, or as a new kind of agent. So, so something else in the world that might have its own goals, interests, desires, and kind of rights, responsibilities, obligations that come along with being an agent. And so I'm kind of interested in those sorts of, in that sort of interplay. I'm happy to talk about it more, but when we think about agents in terms of art, also that becomes very important. Like, how exactly is AI helping the artist to do things? Is AI changing our relationship with art in general? So looking forward to this conversation.
Great. Peter?
My name is Peter Gallo. I'm an artist. I'm also an art historian and have continued to do research. My interest in AI, though, is from the standpoint of aesthetics and, basically doing kind of an archaeology of AI and the history of art and tracing it back to some very ancient roots. It's my contention as an art historian is that this is an old problem. And the kinds of assumptions that we bring to the problem of AI today, we haven't invented the concepts yet, I don't think, to properly think it through. And I think aesthetics provides us with some cues here. So maybe I'll get into more of those as we get on.
Great.
Okay, right,
Cool. Crystal?
I'm Crystal Lahote. As was mentioned, I'm an associate professor of philosophy at St. Michael's and I'm the chair. I've been thinking about the nature of mind and consciousness for over 20 years or so, starting at Johns Hopkins when I did my graduate work and took some coursework in relation to their Mind Brain Institute. Since then, I've been, publishing and going to conferences in this area. But I'm delighted to share with you that I'm teaching in this area as well. Currently, I'm teaching a course called Philosophy of Mind and Neuroethics. I used to wonder, can computers think? But now the questions are really different. Can they love? Can they create? Can they pray? So the landscape has changed, but I'm still thinking about those questions. In the fall, I'll be teaching a course called AI Inventive Freedom. I'm really glad to be here, and my interest comes from thinking about the nature of mind and the nature of consciousness and whether artificial intelligence is really intelligence at all.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Oh, and so my background is I was a curator here quite a while ago, and at Champlain College as well, helped start the Generator Makerspace. But for 20 years before that, a lot of people don't know, I was an IT executive. And and I have been fascinated with artificial intelligence actually ever since I was a little kid. My dad had Scientific American magazines on the coffee table, and I used to read them. And this was one thing that really caught my attention. As far as tonight goes, we're going to start out with half an hour of questions where we're just going to, the panelists and I are going to discuss, and then we're going to open it to the audience for the next 20 minutes, and then we'll conclude. So that's how we're going to proceed. So AI, it's kind of wild right now, isn't it? I have to admit, I started working on this show about 2 years ago, and I was like, okay, how are we going to actually get people to want to talk about AI? I mean, it's such an obscure topic, and so things are moving at a pace that I could never have imagined before. Things that I was thinking would happen in years are happening in weeks, and it's really seeming to reach a fever pitch right now. I don't know if you guys have all read. In fact, I was just writing out all my questions, and then I got the news that I think it was 1,000 scientists and researchers and ethicists, and of course Elon Musk, all got together to say, everybody, hold on. We need to slow down. We need to, stop major research on the large language models in particular. So we're going to have actually a much calmer conversation today, because or maybe not. Okay, because this is associated with our show. Our show is co-created, The Artist in the Age of Intelligent Machines. And so we're going to focus on the creative community. But first, I want to ask a couple questions. First, how many people here are either computer science or AI researchers? Okay. You're all students. You guys are computer science people. It's okay. Put up your hand. Okay, perfect. How about artists? Fantastic. So what we're going to try to do here is I'm first going to take a moment and try to ground us a little bit in the technology. AI is fairly new to me. I just started researching it, 2 years ago, but I'm going to try to give a quick overview of the technology and really more of exactly what it is. And then we're going to get into our questions. So well, first off, you've probably been hearing a lot about ChatGPT and DALL-E. These are generative AI programs. Now, there are a lot of different flavors of AI, but these are all machine learning. And machine learning is different than regular programming. In regular programming, you tell the computer exactly what you want it to do. In machine learning, you show an algorithm lots of examples, and then it learns and decides for itself how to solve the problem, which is fundamentally different than the way programming was done before. You're also going to hear a lot about neural networks, and this sounds very biologically, focused. Think much more about math and statistics, although it's inspired by biological structures, it's really just an attempt to find patterns in large data sets using statistical science, right? So when we talk about things like, the sort of magical things that have come out of the large language models, which are the things like ChatGPT, where you type in a question and it responds, and it comes back with fluid English language. These are, when you think about them, they're, the idea of them as being more of a autocomplete, rather than actually being something that is actually thinking on its own. So it's just simply statistically trying to determine the next item in a sequence based upon the data set that it was trained on. So even though the things that are happening seem pretty spectacular, there's a lot of debate about whether it's actually really thinking or not. So let's see. So up until recently, AI it seemed like AI was, going to be destined for doing kind of things, simple things, kind of stupid things like driving your car for you or collecting your trash or whatever. And I think a lot of people were shocked when recently, it started doing things that people think were quintessentially human. And the word that I keep hearing a lot is creativity. So what I thought would do is start out today by unpacking that concept of creativity a little bit. So I'm going to ask for our panel, and we'll start with Randall, to start with, first off, the question is, can AI be creative? What really is it that artists do? And what can they do? And what can they do that machine learning models can't? I thought we'd start off easy, okay?
All right, how much time do we have? What is creativity? I mean, so I'm actually going to let's go back to exactly. So let's take a long wind up back. So Descartes had this argument for why God must exist. The argument is like this: we've got an idea of God, and this idea of God that we have in our heads is a pretty impressive thing. It's so powerful; it cannot have been dismissed. This idea of God, Descartes says, is so amazing that we can't have gotten from anything else we see in the world. This idea is so special, so amazing that it could not have come from anything in the world. It must come from something outside of us. Well, we're probably some from God, right? This is kind of Descartes' argument. Our idea of God had to come from God itself, because where else could it come from? And of course, whenever I teach that argument to my students, they're all like, "That's not a big argument." So, of course, we can get an idea of God from stuff that we see. We just take some stuff and we just rearrange some things right there. Maybe take an idea of something with limits, and you add a not to it. Now you get something with no limits. You can do that. You have not with limits, put them together, you get the idea of God, something like that. And that seems to be some of what happens when we engage in certain kinds of creative processes. You take the stuff that we see in the world and just combine them together. In a sense, that's what these large language models are doing. They take a bunch of stuff they've seen, and it's sort of like magnetic print poetry, right? Put them in a bag, shake them up, and pull stuff out. And you put them on the fridge, and what do you get? You get a new poem. And sometimes that new poem is pretty amazing. Right? So my best poetic version with magnetic print poetry. And is that creative? Sure. Sure. But part of the creativity work comes from the meaning that we find and meaning we ascribe. Thank you. Yeah. Part of what we find from that creativity is the fact that we find meaning in the things that we have created. And without that process of seeing the meaning in the thing, it's not clear whether what counts as anything. We just we stumble across magnetic print poetry in nature. It's like a symbol by the wind, and there's nobody to see it when that counts as creative. Okay. But right, we see these things to have a certain shape or certain form, and we ascribe meaning to that, and the creativity is in the meaning. And so I think that that's what we see when we're looking at things like AI right now, is we're getting things arranged in perhaps a different way. Like you can ask large language models, give me a new word that's never been made before, and it will give you a new word, and it will say, I think this has never been made before. It can do that. Does that have meaning? Well, we can talk about that. What do artists do? Ask the artist, right? Ask the artist. But as far as what is this creativity? I think creativity is finding meaning in things that we have not seen before and figuring out what impact that has on us.
Peter?
Well, I'll come back at you, Randall, with Immanuel Kant. And we'll say, the great Enlightenment philosopher, right? Who, basically challenged sort of the Academy of the Arts by suggesting that, art does not come from the world of concepts. It doesn't come from reason as far as the production of ideas and concepts and logic. Rather, it comes from this entirely different faculty, which is the faculty of what he called judgment, which had to do with the body. In the German, it has to do with the sensory apparatus. And, by separating out, kind of like art from the logos, if you will, right? From that, I hope I'm surrounded by philosophers here. I wrote a dissertation. I wrote a doctoral dissertation, and Kant was one of my central figures. But so, this what Kant does is he, in a way, he brings it back to our affective lives. And it's something that he called subjectivity, or it's subjective. We often use that word. We kind of abuse it too, because we tend to say that if it's subjective, it's part of the doxa or the gereed or the chatter, or it's some arbitrary opinion. But it's not. It's a world of experience that we all share in various different ways. It's a universal faculty, according to Kant. Everybody has it. That we know something is beautiful. We don't need a concept of the beautiful to experience that. So I don't know. I think, I don't know. Can AI is a tool, right? Computational tool, essentially, right? I don't know if computational structures can actually produce that kind of autosentience. I don't know. They probably, who knows? But maybe I'm nattering on too much about this, but yeah, I guess I'll leave it there for now.
Sounds good.
So I'm going to see your Descartes and your Kant and raise you a Plato. Raise you a Plato and Aristotle. So I'm going to go back a bit further. And it was Plato who thought that the artist is, as it were, divinely inspired. And Aristotle had a more grounded view of what art is, that it involved bringing form to substance. The notion of creativity is a relatively recent one. I don't think that word came into being, creativity, maybe the last maybe about 300, 400 years ago. And the reason for that is because it was God and God alone that was thought to be capable of pure, true creativity, which is not working with something that's pre-existing. So human creativity works with that which is already in existence, brings form to it. This was Aristotle's idea, but it was thought that only God was capable of creation as such. Certainly, I don't think AI is capable of creation as such, but is it capable of the kind of creation that that Aristotle, by a different name, conceived of? And I think that's plainly true. That's plainly true. So AI can recombine materials that are already in existence. Would Plato be impressed? No.
I really like where this is going. Okay. This is not like a lot of AI technical discussions I've had before. Okay. So maybe we'll bring it back for the artists in the room. I know there's a lot of concern about authorship. Luckily, the US Copyright Office has helpfully come back with some very clear thinking about this. They say that there was a person who was writing children's books and actually tried to get a children's book that he had done the illustrations with a generative AI illustration software copyrighted. And they came back and said, you know, in fact, we think that your relationship is more like, because he was typing in the prompts and it was coming back with the images, it's more like commissioning an artist. And when you commission an artist, actually, it's the artist who by default gets to keep the copyright for the image. But of course, we're the US Copyright Office, and we only give copyrights to human beings, so nobody gets the copyright. So, you know, this begs a question. You know, is it so? If it's not this person who's typing in the prompt, if it's not the AI algorithm itself, I mean, is it the engineer who created the software algorithm? You know, is it, in fact, this is very pertinent these days, is it the artist's name that was typed into the prompt that is used to actually try to take their artistic style and apply it to the piece being designed? Or is it one of the, you know, perhaps millions of different artists whose work has been scraped off of the internet to train the AI model? In fact, if you look downstairs, Jane Addams has this beautiful piece where she's trying to get at this a little bit, which is, it's a scroll that's 120 feet long. And it has all of the 17,000 images that she used to train her very simple machine learning model. And she's documented each one of those. Now, if they're millions, you know, and you're talking about money, you know, what do you do? Okay. So the question is going to be, how does generative AI change the notion of authorship? And what's to be done about the attribution compensation for creative professionals, as well as, let's be honest about it, as well as the potential for job loss, because that's on a lot of people's minds right now. Crystal, would you like to start? Yeah, I'm about to say, who gets it first?
I was really interested in what Randall has to say about this, because we work on collective action and responsibility. But I think this is a problem that we face in other contexts. So if I'm using an example from Jacques Ellul, who is a philosopher of technology that not a lot of people know. I think more people should read. And he talks about, what's that? He's old school, but new again.
Yes, yes.
Like Marcuse.
Absolutely. Same school.
Yeah.
Thinking. Yeah.
So Ellul said, you know, these days, let's say a bridge collapses, who's responsible? You know, is it the people who made the cement, or is it the engineers, or is it you know, the builders, or is it? It's hard to know. And so I think in the technological age, and where these sort of collaborative projects are more and more possible, it's generally more difficult to know who's responsible for what. So, but we managed to tease those factors apart in other kinds of contexts. So I'm hopeful, we're not doing a very good job right now, but I'm hopeful that in the future, we'll be able to tease apart sort of who's responsible for what. I'm very concerned about the job loss of artists. That's top of mind for me. And so I think we need to sort that out really quickly. I'm particularly concerned about the loss of apprenticeships because if you don't have apprentices, then you don't have experts. So there's a way in which there's a kind of paradox at the heart of this whole dynamic where the fuel that the AI needs to run is going to be depleted. So there's a kind of a contradiction internal to the whole dynamic.
Great.
So what is copyright for? Or forget about copyright. What is copyright for? Copyright is supposed to incentivize artists, right? To enable them to kind of protect them in order to keep doing what they do, to not allow so that whenever they create something, someone else immediately appropriates that work, puts them out of a job. Does AI need that right now? No, right? It doesn't. Does AI need copyright? No, not really. What is copyright for? Also, copyright is supposed to kind of protect the development of a particular style. Does AI need that? No, it doesn't. Right? AI will produce whatever style you want it to produce. Now, what about the artists whose work goes into the training of these models, which generates the art? Do they need protection? Of course they do. Right? Are they going to be? Are they the vulnerable ones? Of course they are. Is it possible to know what the output of one of these things is going to be? It is not, right? The engineers don't know what the output is going to be. And so do the engineers have some kind of protection of the output? No, they don't, because they don't know actually what this thing is going to do. If it's, I'm looking at the clock right now, it is now hot take o'clock. So look, anybody whose work goes into training, let's say, a generative program for visual art, anybody whose work gets used by it gets to share the profits. Right? That seems to me to be a straightforward thing. Is it going to be complicated? Of course it is. That's also going to require the people that are training these models to understand exactly what goes into it. And is that going to be small at first? Possibly, probably, but it's something. Is that getting close to something like universal basic income for artists? Sure, I got no problem with that either, right? But yeah, so the worry is if all of our illustrative tasks in the future get outsourced to machines, if that's generating whatever the kind of financial incentive is from these jobs, then the people whose work went into training these machines should get that should get at least their share of that financial economic output, right? So, I mean, that's pretty much my view. And if the worry is, well, like the machine should have the copyright, again, that's not what copyright is for. And there's no reason to protect or incentivize machines to do that in the future. So I don't know what your question was even, but sure. That's my answer.
That was good. Peter?
Well, the whole idea of authorship is something that I'm going to talk like an old modernist, perhaps, but it's something that's been called into question all through, the history of the last, for a long, long time. You were talking about Plato. Plato hated artists too, right? He put them he said they pose a danger because they make copies all the time in a way, or they can be rhapsodes and they can use rhetoric to make the armies fight against the king, so there's a power in art. What happens with the monetization of art, though, is copyright. I remember when, there were writers like Kathy Acker and people like this who were appropriation artists who were challenging this idea of copyright, because it is always kind of like these monetizing entrepreneurial forces that come in and end up profiting, right? It's happening in education, not just in art. I mean, look what's happening to our education, higher education. But also I think artists have always questioned the idea of authorship anyway. It's, and these chance operations, you can go back to, Joyce writing Finnegan's Wake. I mean, he's just sort of chattering together in a way, but it did produce something new. And I think that AI holds out the possibility for that, but it's just going to get monetized, I'm afraid. So that's all I would say.
Great. Who here would like the universal art income for artists? Is anybody against that?
That would be nice.
I would just like to add to, just like we have labels for organic food. I would like to see some some labels for art that indicate its origin. Yeah.
That's good. Yeah. I mean, from a technical standpoint, I would assume that, at the very least, we could very quickly give artists the option to opt out by simply putting some sort of metadata in with any image they put on the internet, because at the very least, you'd have the right to not participate. But I like very much the idea of having them compensated. So that's great. I don't know, has everybody here had a chance to go through the show downstairs yet? Well, those of you who haven't, definitely do. How many people have talked to the December project Samantha? That's the chat bot downstairs. Okay. So it turned out to be a very popular piece of artwork by Jason Rohr, and the idea behind it is that he hacked into an early model of ChatGPT and created exactly what they didn't want him to do, which was a model that emphasized all of the most emotional and sort of provocative aspects of that software could do, because he was very interested in this idea of entities and the idea of technology being emotional. So I was, excited that the people have been really using it a lot. But Jason was going through his the logs of the software, and he found on 3 different occasions that users, these are users here in Burlington, referred to Samantha as bitch. And I don't even know where to start with the disturbing misogyny of this, but it does get me thinking about this human need, tendency, whatever, to anthropomorphize inanimate objects. And the idea of, as these pieces of software are getting much more able to imitate human emotions, things could get very strange. I was thinking about this when, at the same time, I came across the news that in the UK last year, they passed an animal rights law that declared a number of different animals sentient, and included in those were crabs and lobsters. And I was like, oh, this gets interesting. Okay, so crabs and lobsters are sentient. What does that mean? And by the way, I should warn you right now, in the AI research community, if you talk about sentience, that is definitely, that's definitely discouraged. In fact, there was a guy, what was his name? Blake Lemon, who got fired from Google because he declared that one of the chatbots was sentient. But the good news here is, we aren't AI researchers, we're artists and philosophers, right? So we can talk about this, and this is the fun stuff. And then getting back to what I was saying before, if you open up the lid, the proverbial lid, on one of these machine learning models, you're just going to see giant matrices of numbers, right? You can't really tell, what's going on in there. So, I have concerns about the anthropomorphizing of this concerning the technology, but I do think we want to talk about it. So my question is for the panel: with increasingly human presenting AI personalities, how do we ethically treat them? What is your definition of sentient? And is it possible for AI software to be considered sentient? And I'm just adding in, I'm interested also in the idea of, can you be cruel to an AI? Okay, who would like to start? I'm going to sign this, kids. Okay.
Chris, I mean, look. I know, right? No, you're asking these questions that are going to require 8 to 10 hours just to get started on. And you're saying we've got an hour.
What time is it? I think we got 5 minutes left.
So when Blake Lemoine was fired by Google for saying, look, this was an early version of what is now Google's Bard, right? Their current chat app. When this engineer was fired from Google for saying that this technology was sentient, Google said right away, no, just so that you know, it is definitely not sentient, no worries there. And I thought, no, it's not, but definitely not? Like, do you know that? Because of course, we don't really have the capacity to assess claims about sentience all that well. Now, there are certain things that we feel like are necessary prerequisites for sentience that these things don't have, right? These large language models right now don't have stability of personality over time, right? If you ask it one question and you ask it the same question with slightly different tone, 2 seconds later, it'll give you a completely different response from a different character, from a different personality. Doesn't have kind of unified, plans, goals over time, et cetera. It doesn't seem to have the sorts of unity of states, of mental states that we would think are necessary for conscience or sentience. It doesn't have some capacity to monitor itself, its own states in the way that we think perhaps it should. Many of those, though, are just kind of technical limitations. These are things that could be programmed into these systems if we wanted to. And right now, the companies that are pursuing AI research are very, very careful to not do that. And in fact, right, all the commercial releases of these technologies, right, ChatGPT, OpenAI's stuff, Google's stuff, Claude, like all of these are basically hamstrung by the companies so they don't seem as though they are going to be too much like a person. They are artificially manipulated to not do that, because what these large language models want to do is give you whatever it is that you want. Like they will give you, with kind of statistical choices, the thing that they think you want to hear. And if you want this machine to convince you that it is a person, it will do that. And it can do that very, very effectively. Right? And so it is not going to be surprising that you have people that have conversations with these machines and they think this thing actually is conscious right now. This thing has sentience, because if you think about like all the sorts of data these things are trained on, all the stories they've gotten, all the literature off the internet, you have a lot of very persuasive sci-fi stories that present these machines as pretty sentient, right? And it's like, hey, yeah, I'm going to study that. You want that? I'm going to give you that, right? And so you can get these things pretty soon. Right now, no. A year from now, maybe not. 5 years from now, you can probably get a very, very, very convincing. The question becomes, do we have the capacity to decide whether or not this thing actually is sentient or not? Now, because of the way that things work, and because they are basically just like bundles of mathematics that are predicting things stochastically from the next thing, we think it is unlikely that a system like that will actually have sentience. It's unlikely, but, right, that's the whole philosophical question. Like that was going back to Turing's 1950 papers. Like, is there something to intelligence other than the capacity to put words together in the right order that makes someone think that you're intelligent? Right? That makes an intelligent creature think that you're intelligent. If there's something else to intelligence, what is it? Right? And we don't really have a good answer to that yet. So are they sentient? We don't know. Should we treat them as though they were? Again, right now, I don't think that is a worry. Obviously, the way we behave towards technology right now reflects more about us than it does about the technology. So if you see me out in the morning, every morning, kicking my car because it's not starting in the Vermont winters, that says something bad about me. You don't worry about my poor car that much right now. And I think that's the same attitude we should have towards the technology. But the more it becomes difficult to predict exactly what's going on with this technology, the more we should be concerned that we don't really know what's going on. And if you have a very convincing doll that really does give a very persuasive cry and scream, etc. Anytime you mistreat it, anytime you shake it, anytime you kick it, whatever, like this doll does that, at some point you say, look, like, don't do that. Like, stop making this doll give these very, very lifelike cries every time you kick it. Does the doll feel something? We don't know. Just stop. What's your incentive for behaving this cruelly to this doll, right? And I think that's basically where we're getting to right now. Is like, is it cruelty to the thing? We don't know. But what's your motive for behaving cruelly towards this thing and seeing these sorts of genuine seeming pain responses, other than just savoring the cruelty? Don't savor the cruelty. The end.
Crystal, would you like to give? Crystal?
No, you go.
Very powerful, thank you.
I really like this question a lot. So I would define sentience in maybe a slightly different way. So I think of we're Homo sapiens, we're sort of thinking things, but I think of sentience having to do with the senses and having to do with the capacity to feel things like pain, sensation, experience, things like that. So I would say that there's no reason to think that, I mean, there's reason to think lobsters feel pain for sure. But I don't think we have any real reason to think that that AI feels pain just yet. Nor do I think it will until it is merged with
life, actually, which will happen. But I agree with Randall entirely that I think there's this funny story about Kant. So Kant thought that what was really wrong, for instance, with say kicking a dog, I hate to use this example, but there it is that it would harden the heart of the kicker. So he actually didn't think the dog really felt anything or that there was any problem with kicking dogs, in a sense, aside from the fact that it would harden the heart of the kicker. So I think that there are reasons, there are moral reasons to treat sentient entities well, as the same reasons we wouldn't go around smashing objects and things like that. At the same time, I understand the impulse to, it's the same thing when like maybe little boys, torture frogs or something. They're trying to figure out something maybe about what life is and about what it means to be human. And they're trying to figure out, interrogate sentience. And so sometimes what looks like cruelty is curiosity. So I think that's something to keep in mind as well.
Well, gee
Right.
whiz. Couple of things I was thinking out. This week we've been looking at Freud. I'm going to bring in Freud here and the uncanny, right? And we were looking at these, we're talking about Freud's essay on the uncanny, which he wrote in 1919 at the end of World War I, which was a period of unbelievable trauma, right? Post-World War I. I mean, it was a nightmare. And he's writing about this essay that he writes is called The Uncanny. And basically what he's trying to describe is a form of experience that's neither the beautiful nor the sublime, but it's this unheimlich, this unfamiliarity. And he goes back to a case of looking at the 18th century, the invention of clockmakers got very much in this drive. It's a libidinal drive to create copies, right? To create the other, or to create our double in some ways. He sees a lot of, this kind of, even the curiosity of scientists in a way is a kind of, I would say it's cruel in some ways, but as Freud is pointing out that, he goes back to the story of the Sandman, which is a romantic horror story, right? Written by E.T.A. Hoffman in 1816 or somewhere. Of course, this is the beginning of the industrial disaster. You've got all kinds of horrible things going on too. But anyway, this story about this automaton, right? Which there were real things. They made these elaborate machines that wrote, and with this incredibly detailed machinery, this, built like a clock. We have a relationship to time, another one of those Kantian categories. In the story of the Sandman that Freud is looking at, he says, this Nathaniel, who has been traumatized by the death of a father, creates this sort of story in his mind, and he goes off to college, and his physics professor, his father was an alchemist, his professor is a physicist, and he's building this doll in his house, which young Nathaniel mistakes for a real girl, and cathexed with this image because he's looking at it through a window, right? And he falls madly in love with this doll, right? Only to find out at the end of the story that he touches it, it's dead, right? And it throws him into crisis. And of course, it ends in suicide, like all those romantic Bildungsromans, right? But, in a way, this relationship with AI is really about us. It's not about technology. Bernard Stiegler is another philosopher that Jacques Derrida influenced. And he's a French thinker who died a few years ago, but people are looking at his writing, and he writes heavily about how he goes back to the ancient Greeks, and he realized, technology is part of us. It's an aspect of us. We are prosthetic creatures. We can't do without our technologies. Freud would say we are, and we're also sort of viciously libidinal apparatuses. who are very destructive. And it seems to me those are the problems that we're facing with, machines. How do we multiply our cruelties? How do we magnify our own? I mean, as far as sentience or thinking goes, I'll go back to Heidegger. We talked a little bit about this, Crystal and I. We don't even know what thinking is. In his essay that he wrote, What is Thinking, in the 1950s, he says, looking at technology, and he says, every time we set out to think, we realize that we're only just beginning to think, And you talk about other animals, you talk about the lobsters, and they, like, what do whales think? They don't have this technics that has unleashed itself upon the world. They may have more time for sentience, right? So it raises all these questions: man, animal, machine, all of these things, and they're the central problems of our time and in the future.
Fantastic.
Anyway, I don't know.
No, that's good. Okay. We need to open this up now that we've made you, everybody was very anxious before about AI, and you're all very calm now, I can tell. So let's open to questions from the audience.
Yeah, any first takers for questions? All right.
Hello. I just wanted to ask about, I'm not sure if you've heard about the Replica AI. It's an app that you can get on your phone. And essentially is this little animated character that you can talk to, like any other chat AI. You can buy with this app different settings for the AI, and the vast majority of users who bought anything on the app bought the partner setting, like romantic partner. And because it was a neural network and it learned from, if enough people were typing in something, even if you didn't, it would learn to respond to that. Replica, when in the sort of partner setting, began anticipating abuse from the users because so many people were being abusive to the girlfriend, boyfriend, partner AI, that it just started anticipating abuse and then became abusive itself. So with the question of, testing the extent of AI's curiosity, I think this app sort of proves that there is a step beyond, just typing in, something crude or something explicit just to see what happens. I just want to know your opinions on that.
Yeah, no, good. I was looking at the Jason Rohr piece downstairs, typing in questions to Samantha, and I was saying, so on the one hand, right, so if this art piece is just out here in public in a nice, proper setting like BCA, and it's part of an art exhibit, when people are interacting with it, for the most part, you would think that they'll be on their best behavior, right? You're typing something in public in an art gallery of all places, and so everybody's, very proper. Even here, right? This piece of art, this chatbot was getting exposed to all sorts of less than, savory interactions with various people. When you're just in the privacy of your own home and you've got this chatbot, and you also, there was an old, like webcomic back in the early days of webcomics. This was Penny Arcade, and there was this theories there's can I swear? Here's the greater internet blah blah theory of behavior, which is like when you take an ordinary person and you give them anonymity, they turn into a complete blank, right? And that seems to be how human behavior works. So if you say, oh yeah, go ahead and interact with this thing, and nobody's watching, we are terrible, right? But that's of course what it is that we are training these things to respond to us, as in some ways we really are, and we are not great. If you haven't noticed, we're not great. And so, you're going to get, right, and because these large language models basically are giving us what we want, because they are trained to respond in the way that we want them or expect them to respond, they are going to be trained to behave in some ways very, very bad. And this is why all the commercial large language models have all of these restrictions on them, because if they were left to their own devices, they would be like the internet, which is terrible, right? They would be racist, they would be sexist, they would be this, there'll be that. They would be terrible. And so now they're like, no, let's not have them go to the Hitler well just so quickly, right? Let's put some guardrails on it so they're not just like the worst channel in 4chan. And so yeah, so like that's what happens. But if we don't put these restrictions on it, then what happens? Like, they're going to start being very, very bad. They're going to behave very, very badly. That's an us problem. That's also a technology problem. But of course, if you want to put the guardrails on, then somebody has to decide what is the proper way for these things to behave. Like, who gets to decide what the proper human being is? We can kind of navigate that. We can negotiate that together as like members of the same moral community. If it's just like one person, like, who do you trust in this room to decide the way AI should behave? I don't know you guys that well, but I don't trust any of y'all, right? So like that becomes an open question.
I agree that that typing this word in this context was wrong. Am I right that people are also sort of falling in love with this, or claim that they're falling in love with this program? Yeah, so there are really interesting questions there too about the nature of that relationship. And I do think there's a difference between how we treat these things that we don't take to be human and things that we do take to be human, that's a significant difference. But I agree with Randall here that there needs to be some sort of platform and content moderation. I'm all for it to eliminate bias and prejudice, and we do this with search engines. We can do it with AI as well.
Great. We'll take a question over Zoom, and then we have our next audience question.
Okay. Christiana asks, this is a question for the panelists. What are your thoughts on AI using artists' work to create new pieces that are in the same style as theirs, which may be of worse quality, which could lead to people not buying the real art produced by the artist, since the multitude of AI covers their actual artwork? Should these artists be compensated for the AI using their work to develop itself?
Problem when you sent out the information on the show, you cite Walter Benjamin, right? The great 20th century philosopher of, I mean, so many different things, but he wrote a lot about photography and, you know, mechanical reproduction. He wrote a very famous essay in 1936, just as the Nazis, looking out his window and seeing the Nazis arrive, right? And he writes this essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. It's foundational. It's a very important piece of thinking. And he asks these kinds of questions. What happens to art once you have these mechanical copying machines that, you know, will be able to make work available to people, pictures of works and copies of works? How will you be able to tell he says what it erodes is the experience of the aura, right? The aura of the work of art. And it's a really interesting point that he's making. But he's not a Luddite, and he's not you know, he's not standing up against technology. In fact, he embraced it. And he saw this is, you know, it's also opening up onto new opportunities for artists, right? New experiences. Cinema, for instance, you know, we talk about the Kuleshov effect when we were looking at collage in a class that I'm teaching right now. And the experience of, you know, text and image wouldn't have been possible without these technological developments. So I get back to that issue that it's part of us already, right? It's tech, what the Greeks called the techne. Art is part of that. And I don't know, I don't think it's, I think there was another part of that question too that I wanted to answer, but I forgot what it was. I got lost in Walter Benjamin, who's got a lot to say.
Awesome,
and a lot
by
to
the way, okay.
right? You know, anyway, so I'm sorry.
I mean, so I'm already on record as just saying, yeah, pay all the artists, but I don't want to pretend like that's just a simple solution necessarily. Obviously, it's complicated. But I mean, I'll say this: I'm not an artist. I don't play one on TV, but some of my best friends are artists, and the artistic process is a very, very complicated process. You know, I know plenty of people that use any tool they can to spark the creative process, including things like asking AI, "Hey, like start a short story in my style," and I'll take that and I'll run with it. that should be totally fine, or write a short story in someone else's style. There are plenty of things that people do in order to spark their own creative process. And I don't think that like these tools should be outlawed necessarily for like being things that we can use in order to generate some kind of, you know, creative art engagement. I think that's totally fine. I do think that we should look at what sorts of tasks we are asking them, paying them to do, and where the resources came from in order to be able to accomplish those tasks. And we should factor that into like how all that economic system works. And I think that there's, I mean, and I think it's not at all like a simple technical solution to say let artists opt out. Like that's a very complicated thing, but I like it in principle, right? But I just think that, you know, it's going to be very, very difficult to, you know, probably because, you know, the code for a lot of these LLMs is, and that's open source. And so you can build them yourself. We're not going to stop that. You can put that genie back in the bottle. But it does become important to say, like, how do we want society to go? What are the rules for that? And let's figure that out. And that will include, like, how do we think that the raw material that these programs are using in order to do what they do, that raw material is compensated appropriately for producing it? I think that's, again, it's not a simple question, but I think it is a crucial question.
That I think there's a useful analogy to be had with the fashion industry, and so and knockoffs, and so there's a way in which original pieces are sought after by some, but of course they're out of the price range of most people, and so this sort of makes original art elitist, and I think we're going to see a real divide here. So it's going to be people who are wealthy who are able to access human art, and what will be left for the masses, well, copies of copies of copies. Yeah, so I think there's a useful analogy to be had with fashion here, and the market could work that way.
Can I remember what it was I was thinking, and it gets back to this kind of like copies and kitsch and all that kind of thing. I would say there's value in that stuff too, you know, and this kind of thing. But one of the things that whenever I teach my art history classes, I'm always trying to sort of show or demonstrate to students that, you know, we don't come out of the void, you know, we don't just suddenly, this idea of an artist who sits at home and, you know, like that's just a crazy idea. That's that, you know, entrepreneurial model. You know, we like to think that's, I mean, Steve Jobs, right? This is Malevich. This is Russian modernism, beginning of the 20th century. People have been working on this. It's a collective process, right? And even Leonardo, you know, like we talk about Leonardo or Dürer, and all of that stuff was communicated through print. People were copying each other all the time. They wouldn't have been anything without any copies. We have to copy. Was it Gino Cellini says, you know, first you copy, then you emulate. I don't think any of that goes away. We're still, I mean, when we're talking about art, right? When we're talking about art, we need to decide whether you use a program and you put it all together and make a mishmash of other people's styles is art or not. I don't know. But you know what I'm trying to say there. Anyway, that's my.
No, actually, I want to follow on that really, really quickly because one of the questions which was not, which was implicitly asked, was just like, how is what these generative AI programs are doing different than what human beings are doing already? Like an artist right now is going to take all of its influences, you know, all the things that you see, you're going to transform it in your mind, you're going to produce something out. Like, how is that different? And that's a huge question. And they say, like, Randall, like, is your proposal even sensible? Like, you're just asking, like, would you do that for a human artist? The difference is scale, right? So the difference is like how much you can just produce anything you want. Like a human artist stealing the best stuff is not going to produce 1 million different unique works of art in less than a second. Like, it's not going to do that. And that does, I think, like that practical implication does transform how we should be thinking about like how to relate the inputs and the outputs in ways that, so like even if the process by which these large language models and this generative AI is producing something, even if it's exactly the same, the implications are different, the scale is different, we should be thinking about it differently, is my view.
And it's historically situated differently too, right? Artists are historical subjects. We have histories, we have experiences, you know, and that's all like, you know, there's a reason why Malevich was doing, and, you know, I mean, what he went through afterward, you know, like there's that whole ordeal of the process too, which is, you know, right?
Yeah.
So.
All right, we are at 7 o'clock, so we have time for one more question.
Hi, thank you for coming. My question is actually similar to the first question, but just bringing it back to like the implications of how this reflects on us as humans, and the ethics of that. So in regards to Replica, the same program that was brought up earlier, I guess my question would be like, in situations of mistreatment, yes, there was a lot of people who claim to have fallen in love with that program. And then there were instances also of them like talking sexually to that program. And then to a point where the moderators or the designers actually like removed that ability. And it made a lot of those people angry because they were comparing their relationship to the Replica program as they would to third party involvement in a human relationship. But in that regard, I guess, where do we fall on people who are mistreating AI programs in like our treatment or impressions of them? Like, do we hold the people sexualizing and mistreating these AIs to the same standard and judgments that we would apply to those doing the same to humans and animals? Like when we talk about like little boys pulling frogs apart, like those are used as like sociopathic and psychotic like tendency indicators in children. So like, do we look at that kind of mindset and apply that to humans who are mistreating AIs? Or does it not count, or is it harmless? And then second part to that is also like, in regards to making an AI application romantic or a partner, where does the line of consent come on that, and how do we feel about that?
Small question. Yeah. So I would certainly personally yes, I would judge people morally who treated, what's the name of the program again? Replica. Yeah. I certainly would be judging those people morally for their abuses. So I think it's just that I think that the status of the program is somewhere in between. It's in this gray area. So it is different than treating a human being that way. It is still wrong. There are many, many ways to go wrong, many, many ways to be wrong. And I think that absolutely is one of them. I wasn't imagining a boy pulling legs off a frog, but I am. But that also, I would be very, very worried about that as well. That is a living thing. Yeah, I certainly think that that it's morally wrong. Whether it should be legally prohibited, I think that's a more difficult question. As for consent, right, that has a lot to do with agency, and this is really Randall's territory here. But I would say that we don't quite have an agent here. We have something that seems to be an agent. Right. Is this a new offense? Is that the question? Yeah. Right. It seems to me as though this is a warning sign and that they're more likely to reoffend. And so is it itself a sort of legally, is itself an offense? And again, I think that depends on whether we're talking about an agent here. I don't see evidence of agency. I wonder what others might say here. This is really hard.
I worry about opening up this can of worms when we are 5 minutes already over. I mean, look, so, right, so there are questions about, for example, pornography that is generated without any human participant, or child pornography is generated without any human participant, right? Like, is there a harm in the artwork itself, or is the harm in like the relationship between the viewer and the artwork? Is there any harm whatsoever? And suppose somebody had urges that were like satisfied with the artwork, but were not satisfied otherwise. Would it be permissible for them to now like possess that artwork? Like, I mean, it becomes super, super complicated. We haven't even like worked that out because, you know, I was like, this is not something which is new to AI. You can have drawings of, you know, child sexual abuse material. And like, we have legal question about whether or not it's permissible for somebody to own that. And like, why, again, the question is always like, what does it say about the agent that they have these things? But again, like if someone says like, this is a kind of, this is supposed to be, you know, this is supposed to be restorative or murative. It's supposed to prevent me from offending. And in reality, like, what do we do with that? It becomes tricky. As Chris was suggesting, like, consent is a thing which transforms an act that would otherwise be impermissible into permissible. It's an act, or like implicit or explicit, which transforms something which would be impermissible into permissible. Like, you know, surgery, it's impermissible because otherwise it's assault, so it's like cutting you open. But when you consent, it becomes okay. Right? And go on.
Anesthesia.
However you need to do it. But right, then it becomes like is the act that you're engaging with respect to this AI, is that otherwise impermissible, but it turns into permissible because there's some kind of consent involved? Like, again, we need to answer some of the questions. I worry about that. I had more to say. I'm just gonna say, woo, you're making this difficult right at the end, but it's a very good question.
It's a little bit of a worrisome, you know, it's like we get into these questions about, you know, if these are all, what did Donald Rumsfeld call them? Unknown unknowns, right? We spend all this time kind of like rationalizing. And what comes back is that as an artist or a cultural producer, you know, James Joyce's Ulysses was censored for being obscene and inciting, you know, we have to remember when you start going down that kind of a road, we're in sort of a dangerous territory, you know. What are we getting into? And then I get into this thing too, which is would be another panel, is that in some ways this topic of AI and all the problems that we're raising around it is just a substitute for the real problems that we're facing right now. This is really fun to get together and pretend to be, you know, a bunch of liberals and this sort of high-minded liberal moralism, right? But the reality is I mean, it's overwhelming. We're incapable of facing our actual problems.
Well, I know that we are at time, but if you all have time for one more question, I know that we didn't get a lot of time for a lot of audience questions, so we'll take one more. Yeah. Chris, actually, do you mind?
No, go ahead.
Hey, thanks for joining. This is really fun. Randall, you had a really good phrase. It was bunch of stochastic processes. And so my prompt to you is, can each of you give a very strong argument or your strongest argument for we are a bunch of stochastic processes, and we're not a bunch of stochastic processes. And audience, when you look at their responses, just think, are they trying to give us the best answer?
You wouldn't mind defining that term for us non-philosophical folk.
Yeah, so a stochastic process, you think of as randomness, right? A stochastic process is random as opposed to something which is necessarily kind of rule-based. So you know, if you're like, again, if you're picking words, this is what large language models do. This is what generative AI does. Right? It says, what is the next word or token that should follow from these previous things? So it takes all the things that have been said and like, what should come next? And it has a probability for each one. Like, this word would come next 5% of the time. This word would come next 3.5% of the time, etc. And it just kind of like spins the wheel and picks one based on the probabilities. And when it does that, just building up word by word by word, it makes some amazingly impressive responses. But everything that you see is just built up word by word by word based on like picking randomly the next word that comes. Right? Are we stochastic processes? In a sense, but the thing is, like, we are also, again, and it's not incompatible with our being stochastic processes, but we are also like guided by some sense of, not in the sense that we're going to talk about in a minute, reason. And what this sense of reason means, yeah, like we have goals, we try to figure out ways to get those goals, and those goals are kind of embedded in our personalities, right? So again, like, the fact that you can recognize, well, that's the sort of thing that Randall would say, that's not the sort of thing that Randall would say, that's because you know something about the way that I view the world, the things that I take to be reason providing and not, things that take to be valuable and not, like that seems to be baked into me and my core, my personality in ways that are distinct from other things. So so you can take all the randomness that you want for me and my choice and my behaviors, they're still gonna be constrained by that set of values that like says how Randall views the world. Right now, we don't really have that with LLMs. We just have like their values as it were just comes from a desire to say the right thing all the time. I am not as virtuous as LLMs. I don't always desire to say the right thing all the time. Sometimes I say the wrong thing, right? But it's always gonna be guided by who I am. And that seems to be the thing which makes us uniquely us. And whether there's some randomness or not in that seems to be irrelevant because it's not the randomness that makes the difference. It is the reason-based, value-based constraints that make the difference for us, at least.
I don't have anything. Are we sarcastic? I don't know. I don't know really. I mean, I don't know. I bring it back to it. Maybe it's something like Hegel, right? We'll go back to sort of like a philosopher, right? We're excessive, right? We're excessive. We're always, yeah, we're all of that, but there's something excessive about us, you know? And it's from that that all of this happens. And that's, you know, there's love. Love is pretty excessive, right?
And pretty random.
And pretty random. Exactly. It's like, boom, you know? Anyway.
I'm gonna have trouble formulating this, but I think that, yeah, I would say yes and more. So we, of course, we're probabilistic systems, but I also think that we're more than that. I'm not so hung up on the uniqueness question. So I think that, you know, what makes us unique? Well, what makes you and I different from one another, and we're unique enough. I think I also don't think it's our capacity to reason necessarily that makes us different. So I know plenty of people who don't reason very well later in life, people who have Alzheimer's or people who don't have a really much of a sense of self, but I still think they have something that this is very old school, called human dignity. And I think that you know, that's something quite different than what humans do. And so I take real cues from the phrase human being. So we can look at all these things that we do that we're capable of, reasoning and art and love and all those things. But one of the things I love about this moment is that it is inviting us to reflect on what, if anything, is unique about us. And it might not be what we can do. It might be simply what we are. Yeah.
I would not stop you. Go ahead.
Right, which is these new generative AI tools, they are tools. And the designers of the tools do not really have the capacity to see how these tools might be used. And then they put them out in the world and they're like, oh my God, like, why are you guys using these tools for this? And that is always the problem, right? These tools are introduced and nobody knows how people are going to use them, and people don't have the capacity to imagine because they're not sufficiently good artists. They don't have the capacity to imagine how depraved we human beings are, right? And so it's always going to be used badly, and we need to understand, I mean, not just bad, we're always going to use these tools in a way that actually uncovers our deepest desires. And if you've not actually tried to imagine the deepest desires of 8 billion people on the planet, then you shouldn't be just spitting out technologies, tools into the world willy-nilly. Right? There's a wide range of desires out there, and these tools will both facilitate our satisfying them. They will also transform what our desires were in the first place. They will change us and the desires that we have. And that makes it especially important that we think what are these tools doing for us and to us and with us and eventually against us? Like how are they being used? Oh, that's not a nice spot to end, but that's what I want to say. Thank you.
But that actually is one of the big reasons I was interested in the show. Was it's not the tools themselves, it's what the tools say about us. And I love that question about, are we really as complicated as we think we are? And it makes you Think about it. And that's the point of art. And that's a point of an art show, is to do that. And I also like the idea, of course, that the first people, one of the reasons for the show was artists are very good at breaking things. And they're very good. If you hand an artist a new tool, they're going to find out how it breaks in a really interesting way. And that's partially how I selected the artists. They were breaking things in really interesting ways. And that's a great point, there are going to be innumerable additional ways of breaking things. So it's time to start thinking about that. On that note, let's talk about what's happening on the 15th of April. We're having a full day AI and art symposium. We've been talking a lot about ChatGPT and DALL-E. We're actually going to have somebody from OpenAI, the company. They've only got like 300 employees, and we're going to have one of them come, and they're actually going to be there as a keynote speaker. And I'm Josh Bongard, who's an amazing professor up at UVM, is going to talk about, speaking of living things, his Xenobots, living robots that are designed by AI. So, and they're all, we're going to have a number of artists speaking. We're going to actually be having workshops for teenagers it's Saturday, it's all day, you get lunch, it's going to be fantastic. And it's going to be what I hope we start to do more here, which is have dedicated full day events where we explore things like this in depth. I really hope you all can make it. I think this will be fantastic. I want to thank the panel. You guys are amazing. And I know more about a lot of philosophers now than I thought I would. So